David Hurley is a former pollster and chief campaign strategist for the Liberals under former Prime Minister Paul Martin. Corey Tonight was Ontario Premier Doug Ford's campaign manager and former Director of Communications for Prime Minister Stephen Harper. And Kathleen Monk is a former NDP strategist and Director of Communications to the late Jack Layton. Hi, everybody. So happy to be with you on a big day. David, I'll start with you. When you think back over the course of this campaign, what do you think it's been about?
I think it's been about leadership, and I think it's been about three people in particular have driven this campaign: Carney, Trump, and Poilievre. And Carney, by being visible change from Trudeau and by projecting quiet economic competence, is one piece of it. Trump, by creating an existential threat to Canada, is another piece of it, because that scared the Bloc Québécois voter into the Liberal camp. That's one of the big developments in this campaign. The other big development relates to Mr. Poilievre, and frankly, I know that he is generating a lot of enthusiasm, and we'll get to that. But he's also generating a lot of fear, and fear among the left. And so that is the reason why New Democrats in large numbers are going to Mark Carney, an avowed capitalist, because of that fear of Poilievre. So the Conservatives ran a campaign that was so designed to motivate Conservatives that they scared the shit out of New Democrats. And the combination of that and Trump and Carney is why we are where we are today.
Great points. Reminder, family show. Corey, you need that reminder as well.
I'm just filling in for Reed, so.
I understand. No. You're much appreciated. Corey also needs a warning about that. Do you think this has been about leadership?
I think leadership is always on the ballot when it comes to election campaigns. These races have a tendency to presidentialize in a way around the leaders of the parties. And I think that's why it's been somewhat challenging for the Conservatives in this race, in that the Poilievre has been polling below the party consistently. Carney has been polling above the party consistently. Singh is, strangely enough, is actually more popular than his party right now for the reason that that David mentioned. But I think that's why we've seen the Conservative ballot question and framing of the vote change a bit over these last couple weeks. They've pulled Poilievre from their ads. They're using former Prime Minister Harper in their advertising to try to bring home some of these voters that have left the Conservative Party, especially older males, who still think fondly of Harper. So, leadership's always on the ballot. It's going to be, I think, a challenging election for the Conservatives as a result of those things. But we'll see whether that enthusiasm within the Conservative base that you see embodied in the rallies that Poilievre's been holding, whether that is greater in its effect than the fear factor for progressive voters that have been fleeing to the Liberals. So we'll lots of excitement tonight. We'll see what happens.
Oh, yeah, for sure. How would you characterize, Kathleen, you're a seasoned campaigner, how would you characterize this campaign? I feel like, the last few elections, we were always talking about how nasty and uncivil things were. I could be totally off the mark, but I just did not feel like this campaign was that nasty or was uncivil. Like, it was fairly serious.
Fairly serious, and you might potentially, depending on what the result is tonight, of course, understanding that people are still going to the polls. But the summary of this campaign might have been over before it started. I would take a bit of I would agree with my colleagues in saying, yes, of course, it's about leadership. Elections always are. But I would go further that I think ultimately this election will probably, if it turns out to be a Liberal government, whether minority or majority, will actually turn out to have been a rejection of right-wing American-style politics, and Trump specifically, that if there's a loser in this campaign, if the Liberals do in fact win tonight, the loser is Trump. And I think that the decision really was made by a majority of Canadians really sometime in mid-March, mid to late March, maybe even before the writ was dropped. I say that because, and Corey and I have talked about this before, on question period, that there's always been a larger proportion of progressive voters in Canada than there have been conservatives. They're generally, at the most, they seem to be able to get is 4 out of 10 voters to come over to their team. And so if there's a case, which there happened to be, unfortunately, in this election, where those progressive voters concentrate, as they have, because of the fear that Mr. Trump has, brought upon Canadians, they can have a higher concentration than conservatives. And that's what we're seeing, where we've seen a lot of New Democrat voters and Bloc voters basically lend their vote. It looks like the Liberals are borrowing some votes in this particular campaign from those other progressive parties. And, and that's how they're probably going to push themselves over that, magic number of 172.
To what degree do you think, David, and if we could in the control room just pull up Trump's latest post today, which essentially argued that Canadians should elect him, to what degree do you think Trump is going to be a motivating factor for people?
Well, I think for a lot of people, he's the motivating factor. That's why the Liberals are in this race. I mean, if you look at how people think about the parties and the leaders when they talk about domestic issues, you see a much lower Liberal vote. You see a much higher NDP vote. You see a very different complexion. If the election was about affordability and housing and healthcare, this would have been a tough election for the Liberal Party. But for many, many Canadians, this election is about Donald Trump. And increasingly what we've seen as the campaign has gone on is a battle between 2 ballot questions. The Conservatives driving the ballot question that existed before Trump about domestic issues and affordability and the record of the Liberal government that was so unpopular. And that is going to drive out more Conservatives than have voted for a very, very long time in Canada. But on the other hand, there seem to be more Canadians who are overlooking what they didn't like about the Trudeau government to say this person in this circumstance is the right person to deal with this issue. And so I think that if the Liberals win this election, they'll have won it because of Donald Trump. If Kamala Harris was the U.S. president, Poilievre would have coasted to victory.
Do you think that's true, Corey? And if the Conservatives win, because again, we don't know, we don't know what the outcome is yet, but if they do, why will they have won, do you think?
Because frustration with the Liberal Party and the record of the government was of greater importance to voters than fear of Trump. I think I'd make one other point, because there's one other factor in this, and that's Justin Trudeau. I think if all other parts remained the same, the Conservatives ran the same campaign that they have in this election, but it was against Justin Trudeau, I think they would be winning a massive majority tonight. And I think the removal of Trudeau from that equation has allowed a change in the frame. The other thing that's interesting that's going on, Vashi, is a lot of what I would describe as core Conservative voters who are older, both men and women, people over the age of 55, have decided to vote Liberal this time, and in much greater numbers than has been the case in the last 4 or 5 elections federally. And I think it's around that Trump issue. Younger voters are going to be more affected by affordability issues. It's younger voters that are fighting to try to get housing. It's younger voters that are whose paycheck is maybe a bit more vulnerable to some of the inflationary pressures that we've seen. And so the Poilievre message that was working in 2024, I think is a lot more appealing to those folks. Older voters, they're seeing the market turmoil from Trump. They're not so worried about housing accessibility because they probably have their own house. So this is a different election in a lot of different ways. But certainly Poilievre has activated a much younger cohort of voters than Conservatives typically do, and at the same time lost some traditional Conservative voters to the Liberals as well.
Corey kind of highlights one of the cleavages, right, between old and young, more so like people who own a home and who don't. There's going to be definitely, an eastern or central component versus, in particular, the prairies, right? And I'm just wondering, Kathleen, as we look ahead, those all point to a massive challenge for whomever wins, to me.
Yeah. Yeah, they do. Whoever becomes prime minister is going to have a huge problem, particularly, I think, if it's, if the numbers are as tight as we're thinking, if it's like 42 to 42 or something like that. And we've seen in past elections, as you know, in 2021 and 2019, that in fact the Conservatives did better in the popular vote, despite not ever forming government. And so I think the next prime minister obviously has some challenges there. I guess the one thing I would add to build on the age differential is that I would just say it's not just the Trump factor that has driven those voters, 55 plus or older voters, over back into the Liberal camp. I did some focus groups last summer, and older voters, both men and women, had some concerns about Poilievre, about his failure to get his security clearance, his concerns around pension, his comments around pensions and the CPP. So there were other latent concerns that I think got activated, especially when the fear of Trump and Trump's threats against Canada and kind of sealed the deal, if you will, which really locked in that older cohort of voters to not voting for Conservatives.
Okay, I got to leave it on that.
Actually,
Oh, yeah, you got the last 30 seconds, David. It's all right.
I think the gender divide is larger than the generation divide.
Right. It is, yeah.
In this election campaign, because the Liberals are actually narrowly ahead among people under the age of 35 because of their strong support among young women. Conservatives win among men up to the age of 55 decisively, and then they're losing. But Liberals are winning among women of all age groups. And I think there is a real resistance among women to Poilievre and to right-wing politics in this country.
Well,
100%.
Another cleavage to deal with on Tuesday. I'll leave it there. Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate the analysis this evening. David Hurley, Corey Tenike, and Kathleen Monk.